All right, well then without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into cascading style sheets. All right. So CSS, which is going to enable us to style our documents. CSS rules control which elements we want to style, how we want to style them. And down here is an example of a rule. We have a LI, and remember that corresponds to one of our HTML elements, right? List item. And we're saying that what we want is the font color for list items to be blue. So that's kind of what CSS does. You define these rules, and then the rules specify specific HTML elements, and then specifies how we want to style those elements. So as you can see, it turns the font color for those list items blue. We have two list items here on the page. Remember, those are the ones that kind of are like bullet points, right? So we have two list items here on the page, and with our CSS rule, we turn them blue. What we're about to learn, the syntax for writing CSS rules, some different ways to choose which elements to change, and some different style properties that we can change. If you excuse me real quick, I've got a Zoom thing. There we go. All right. So HTML and CSS work really well together. The way that this Venn diagram tries to explain it is HTML is the visual components. It is the content, right? It's the actual things that are on the page, and then CSS styles them. Like we talked about a little bit last night, there's some default styling that HTML elements have assigned to them already. And so sometimes there's a little bit of a blurring between what is there by default and what we're going to apply to CSS, to HTML elements with our CSS. So here we have two versions of the exact same content, the exact same HTML. On the left is with CSS, on the right is without CSS. And what CSS is going to enable us to do is, one, position things, right? Group things together. We're going to have things like this languages, this edit box up there on the left side's upper right. We also have this like this div or this grouping with a sort of bluish background, right? Down in like this code section, we have like a gray background with different lines, right? And if you just look at the both of them side by side, the one on the left is much easier to read just by first glance. Things are grouped. Things have a little bit of separation. You understand where the different ideas are, and you can kind of get a sense of what the left is trying to inform you of right off the bat. The one on the right, it's a lot harder to parse, right? And that is one of the big practical reasons to have CSS in your web page, is to give the reader a more efficient experience, to cut down on their parsing, trying to figure out what this document or what this page is telling them. The quicker that we can have them understand and interact with the content on the document, the more enhanced the user experience is going to be. So that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do with the CSS. Now we're going to go over some terms, and here are the terms. The entire thing, when you're defining a CSS chunk here, you create a rule. The entire thing is a rule. It's broken up into two parts. The first is the selector. The selector is going to be responsible for figuring out which HTML element we're going to apply style to. So this is specifically figuring out where on the page we're going to apply this style. And then inside of that, inside of the rule, we have declarations. So you have selectors, and those selectors get declarations. A declaration is broke up into properties and then values. So what we say is we say, okay, select all of the elements that meet this selector, whatever meets that, and then apply border with a width of 1 px, 1 pixel, make it solid red. So give it a solid red border and make the font size italic. So there, once again, you have the rule, which is the whole thing. Then you have the selector, which is just which elements you're going to apply the style to. And then inside that, you have declarations, which are broken up into properties and values. This is kind of a complex rule example, but it's just to show you how specific we can be about which elements we want to select, which elements we want to apply a style to. So like I said, we're going to apply these styles to any elements matching these selectors. Yeah, and it's going to be even for future changes. It's declarative. It is making a statement. It is saying, do this. So selectors. We've got a couple of different types of selectors. We've got a tag, which is just like whatever the element is. So like in this case, it would be A, or it would be div, or it would be P. It'd be the name of the actual element. We have classes, which we talked about last night. IDs, which correspond to what we talked about last night, those attributes of IDs. So in this case, class would be full stack, ID would be academy. And then you can do it also off of attributes themselves. And then we have two more different types of selectors that we won't cover in this class, but they're called pseudo elements and pseudo classes. So like I said, tag would be the A, it would be the element name, then class. Here's the way you write it. You write it dot full stack. That's the syntax for writing a class selector. An IDs selector will be that hash symbol, academy. So if I'm trying to select something by ID, I would do hash whatever it is. Attributes, you wrap with those brackets, and then you basically just write in whatever the attribute and value statement is. Pseudo elements are preceded by the colon, and then pseudo classes are preceded by the single colon. But like I said, in this class, we're mainly going to be focusing on tag, class, and ID. So with selectors, you can have multiple selectors within one rule. And then when you do that, there are these things called combinators. Combinators are just combinations of selectors. And there's 4 different ones. There's 4 different ways to combine them. You can do no space, which means that it's going to be like an element with both whatever the first thing is and whatever the second thing is. In this case, all of the examples are using a tag and a class, but you could also do a class and a class, an ID and a class. But it'll be the thing on the left and the thing on the right. So an element with both tag and class, you just squish them together, no space. Tag space class is going to be an element with a class whose parent or grandparent or other ancestor matches whatever the thing on the left is, whatever that in this case the tag is. Then you have tag comma class, and this is either or. So if the element has either one of these things that matches it, and then the final one is tag caret class, which means an element class whose parent, direct parent, matches whatever the thing on the left is, matches whatever the tag is. These can be a little bit confusing. Any questions on the combinators?
So the parent function would only be like one thing above, whereas ancestor would be like the whole tree.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, a parent is the one that's directly above it, and then an ancestor is, yes, the whole tree. Anything that is parent, grandparent, anything that contains that element. Good question. Okay. And then finally, we can also write comments in CSS, just like we can in HTML. The difference here is just like the syntax, what you write to say that this is a comment. In this case, you do the slash asterisk, and then when you close it off, you do the asterisk other slash. So like on this is a comment. This can go anywhere you want to. Comments in CSS can also be over many lines. Like this is how you can write comments in your CSS. So cascading style sheets. There's a reason they call it cascading style sheets. And that's that when you load in your styling, when you load in these sheets, you can do it one by one, right? You can have multiple CSS files that you apply to an application, and they load in one by one. And just so you guys know, the rule is that whichever CSS rules are applied later, the more later, the latest they're applied, they'll overwrite older rules. So if I have like style sheet 1, style sheet 2, style sheet 3, style sheet 3 will overwrite the other two if there are matching or conflict rules. If two rules on two different sheets are trying to do the same thing or affect the same elements, the later loaded ones will be the ones that overwrite. That's why it's cascading. But we really won't get into like that in this course. I just thought I would tell you. So in this case, we have 3 style sheets, and they are all sort of loaded in and compressed into this style, this style that is applied to the application. So here's an example of sort of what I'm talking about, right? So we have 2 style sheets, and we have style sheet B and style sheet A. As you can see, style sheet A comes after style sheet B. On the right there, in those 2 boxes, you can see that style A selects all list items, all like bullet point type items, and it changes their font color to red. Style sheet B also selects all list items and changes their font size to 40 pixels. So both of these are going to apply. Styles A and styles B both match the item. They get kind of combined into the styles, and the result is that this list item here gets a color red and a font size of 40. Oh, we've also got an inline style there. So like one more thing about styling and in general is that you can also write style equals and then write styling rules right there in your HTML. A lot of times this isn't looked on as very good practice, because if I later on want to change the styling for like list items here, I got to go into specific files and change stuff. It can like make your work like a lot of like very nitty gritty changing files directly, as opposed to referencing something in a CSS sheet and then just making a major change, or like a change that is referenced elsewhere in your HTML. So what happens when two declarations conflict? That's to say, I have an element, right? And I have two rules, two CSS rules that both are trying to select or style the same element. And I have the exact same property trying to be added to them, right? What happens, right? So like here I have div and I have ID thing. And as you can see in like the HTML thing there, there's a div with an ID of thing. The div rule is trying to set a background to red. The thing rule is trying to set a background to blue. So here we go. We've got two rules and they are trying to style or make a declaration about the same property. Both are trying to affect background. So what happens here? What happens is that IDs take precedence over like regular HTML tags, right? IDs are the most like specific, the most preferred thing for these CSS rules. And if you think about it, like we were talking about yesterday, like IDs are attributes that enable us to select only one element, right? That's the idea of it, is there's a single element with this ID. So that's why, like, you know, like if I make an ID selector in my CSS rule, like it's more specific to say like, so do something to this one specific element than all divs, right? So that's a long roundabout way of saying that IDs are take precedence over regular tags. Here we go, we got another example. We've got a class on a div, right? Class foo on this div. On the left, we have the tag rule versus the class rule on the right. They're both trying to affect background, red and green respectively. Which one wins? It's class. And if you think about it, like we talked about the attribute discussion yesterday, classes are used to select a specific set of HTML elements. So they're more specific. They're referencing something more specific than all divs. It's more specific to say, hey, give me all the divs with this foo class on them than give me all divs on the page, right? So classes also beat out HTML tags. What about IDs? Okay, we got ID versus class. ID is a thing, and then we've got two classes on this div, foo and bar. So does anybody want to take a guess of which one will win out?
I would think that the class would, since it's a little further down in the specifics of what it is.
Yeah, so if you think about it, though, when we're trying to select something, right? IDs are, I want to select this singular item that is thing, right? There's only one element on the page with an ID of thing, where class might exist on several divs, right? It's a group versus a single thing. So if you think about just like the English word specific, right? The thing, the ID, the singular instance is more specific than a group or a collection of elements with a class on it, right? And so that's why IDs take precedent over classes. So based on the examples that we saw here, the most specific thing or the selector that will always win out is an ID. Below that is a class. Classes are second place to IDs, and then HTML tags are the third thing in there. There's one more I forgot to mention, but is inline style. Inline style beats everything. inline style is the most specific, takes the most precedent. It will override any rule that you put in your CSS file. Because that's the case, inline styling can also make it really hard to debug your styling, right? Like if I'm writing CSS files and I'm saying, okay, I want the background to be blue, and then it suddenly comes up in this case as orange, and I don't remember writing inline styling in my HTML, I'll be going through all of these files and saying, where did I define this? And I'll go to my HTML and it's there. So that's another reason why like inline styling, writing styling on your HTML is usually not best practice. But that's it. That's sort of the rundown of CSS. This kind of shows what it's like to develop with CSS. It's a constant fluid process where you're just trying to adapt and figure out what looks exactly right. It's definitely more of an art than a science. Yep. Okay. So that's CSS. Any questions on any of that?